All right, let's start.
Awesome. Okay, welcome to Scripting Solutions for School. My name is Amy Bowker, and I'm a Google Education Trainer, and I also plan EdCamp Ottawa, and that's where I met James Peterson, and I'm very honored to introduce him. I met James at EdCamp, as I just said, that I helped plan, and he is one of the smartest people I know about Google. So I proceeded to bother him with many questions, as I do today, and I continue to do. So you guys are in very good hands today. He is currently working as an educational consultant for Amplified IT. He is a Google certified teacher. He is an authorized Google education trainer, a YouTube certified educator, and a co-leader of Google Educator Group Montreal, and also a Google and Script Ninja. That's just my title. And if you guys have any questions, just let us know by typing them into the event page, and we will be answering them at the end. So here's James. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Amy. So, as Amy said, I'm all of those fancy titles and everything. The big thing is that I'm not actually a computer programmer. So I'm first and foremost a teacher. And writing Google Apps script is an exercise in programming, but it's not something that's impossible for you to do. So there's no one path into writing code. There's a bunch of different ways to get started. We all take our own steps into how we approach writing code and why we do it. I began it through using spreadsheets. I absolutely love spreadsheets. I use them for all sorts of stuff. And I started to explore what they can do with different logic statements using if formulas and trying to get complex behavior. All the class document management issues that I had, I ended up using spreadsheets to handle. So eventually, I realized that these really long, complicated, somewhat messy-looking formulas weren't the most efficient way to go about it. So I went into the script editor, and I started learning how to actually create things that are more efficient, more effective, and more easy to understand. I like to call myself an educoder. That has some connotations to it. First and foremost, I'm an educator. I'm curious, I'm passionate, and I'm interested in learning and how technology can facilitate learning. I also like to play with things. I'm a tinkerer. I like to take things apart and see what makes them tick. I like to play with things and see if I can figure out if I can make them better. And I like to explore, learn, and apply what I'm learning. And doing that creates a cycle where I am curious, I tinker to solve problems, I apply what I've learned, and I look at what I've learned and apply that to my tinkering. So it's very much a cycle. Learning to code is full of challenges. This is a graph from a very good article on the web called Why Learning to Code is So Damn Hard, and it explains a lot about the journey of learning how to code. Initially, when you first start, you're over here and there's a huge peak, and that's because you're following these pre-programmed tutorials. They're very laid out for success. You have access to the source code. It's very much about copying and pasting. Once you hit this peak here, it's called the cliff of confusion, and that's when you start trying to solve your own unique problems. And it can feel like all of a sudden all the wheels have fallen off, because now you're in a desert of not having information, not fully understanding how you're solving problems, and it can be very frustrating. But once you continue working and you start building skills and connections, it becomes a very rewarding thing to do, to write code and to apply it and to see what you've done come to life. So why do I think it's important to learn how to write code as an educator? Well, the first thing is to build your search skills. This is true for teachers and for students. When you're in that valley of trying to understand why your code doesn't work, you become a very proficient searcher. You're able to find information, you're able to understand what you're coming across and whether or not it's useful, and you're able to figure out where to turn when you need help. Second reason to learn to code is becoming part of a community. You can connect with other people, you can ask questions and get answers and get support. Coding is very much a community activity. My trick is to connect with people who are far smarter than I am and take their ideas and try and incorporate it as much as I can into my own ideas. And the final reason to code is that it takes grit. It takes persistence. You have to continue working when you encounter an obstacle and develop lateral thinking skills to approach problems in new ways. It's almost a hacker mindset where you're looking for how you can manipulate tools to do what you want them to do rather than what they were initially designed to do. That's what I like to do with spreadsheets. So when I'm writing code, I have a typical workflow. It starts with defining the problem, spending time strategizing how I'm going to work on it, the actual coding part, which is surprisingly less than you might expect, and then troubleshooting the code once you've written it. This is probably where I spend most of my time. It's important to understand the task that you want to do. Before you begin, understand what it is you want to do and figure out what all the pieces are that have to be solved in order to accomplish your big task. Break it into smaller pieces. And start with the ones that are easiest for you to understand and to create. Once you know what your easy win is going to be, you define the scope of that piece. And what I mean by scope is you need to understand where it starts, what it takes in, what it needs to do, and what it gives back to the rest of your code.
James,
Writing
sorry
code?
just to interrupt.
Sure.
We just can't see the slides on the main screen. So it's a little hard to see. Perfect, thank
There
you.
we go. Writing the code is actually a smaller part than you might expect. So you spend your time figuring out what it is you want to write. When you actually write the code, it may not take that long. Then you need to check, does it perform as expected? If it does, that's great. You move on to the next challenge. But more often than not, it doesn't perform exactly as expected. And that's when you move into troubleshooting. So when it doesn't perform what you think it will, you have to identify the problem. If you can identify the problem, you figure out what you need to change, you write the code, and then you test it again. And that's a very short loop. But when you can't figure out what the problem is, you need to break it down. Check what you've last changed, and then start with where you suspect the problem is and break those changes down into smaller pieces and continue from there. One of the problems that I wanted to solve was creating a master grade book. I use spreadsheets to create a master grade book, and when you're using Google Apps for education, you can quickly get overwhelmed. So I've created an example grade book that's going to take care of a lot of that document management for me. If you want to follow along, you can click on this link, or you can type in this URL. It's also listed in the resources page on the Education On Air website, and you can make a copy of this example spreadsheet. This is going to take care of a lot of those problems for me. The first thing to do is to understand what the task is that I'm going to solve. I like Google Forms. I use them quite often, and I use scripts to grade them. So I really like Flubaroo. And when you're starting off, it's fantastic because you can quickly create a form and you can quickly grade it. But once you get into using forms, it's easy to get overwhelmed. And you end up buried in a whole lot of spreadsheets with a whole lot of grades in them, and you have to go in and manually put them all together into one spot so that you can quickly find your grade book. So I decided to break this into smaller pieces. What are the pieces of the puzzle that need to be solved in order to create a central gradebook? Well, first, we need to sort through Drive and find all of the forms that have been graded by Flubaroo. We need to collect everything into one place. We need to look up each individual student's results, and then we need to calculate the weighted average for each student. I wanted to see where I could start. And the easy part for me has to be calculating weighted average for each student. You can do this with a regular spreadsheet function just by multiplying the grade times the weight, but it doesn't expand easily. What happens when you add another result to that with a new weight? Well, that means you have to modify that formula for every single student in your class. Instead of doing that, let's write a custom function to take care of weighting those averages for us. To create custom functions in a spreadsheet, you click on the Tools menu and you go into the script editor. It'll pop up a window saying, what do you want to do? Do you want to have a script that's attached to a spreadsheet? I always dismiss that, highlight everything and delete it and start from scratch. So the first thing we need to do is define our custom function. And I did that with this line that says function weighted average, mark, and weight. There's a protocol where if you're writing a custom function, you name the function in all uppercase letters. It's not necessary, but it just makes it a little more readable because every formula in a spreadsheet shows as all capitals. So I've done that here. I've taken in two parameters. I've taken in the mark and I've taken in the weight of the mark. Ranges, when they're passed into a custom spreadsheet function, are actually two-dimensional arrays. So it doesn't matter if I pass this a single row. My app script expects two or more rows. So I need to actually tell my custom function that I'm working with only the first row. And that's what these lines here do, is they take the first row from those ranges. So if I input multiple rows into my function, weighted average, it's going to ignore those other rows and just use the first one. I've done a little bit of error checking here as well. So I wanted to check that my mark length and my weight length are the same. So I've chosen two ranges. One is all the marks, and the second range, all the weights that correspond to those marks. They need to be the same size. If they're not the same size, I have a line here that will return an error that says mismatched range length. That gives me a little bit of information in my spreadsheet when I try and use this function. I also want to check that the total weight adds up to 1 or 100. I wanted to make this a little more flexible than requiring everything be in percent. So I can do either whole numbers that sum to 100 or percents or decimals that sum to 1. If they don't add up to 1 or to 100, then it's going to return this error that the weights must sum to 100. I can now actually get into the problem, which is calculating the weighted average. I start by creating a variable to store the sum, which will be the result, the actual sum of all the weighted marks. And then I need to loop through my marks. So I go through and I start with the first mark in the range, and I continue on. Now this first if statement here actually checks if the weight of the mark I'm calculating is 0. I'll skip that and continue. The reason I've done that is it will make it a little easier to account for missing grades. If I have a student who didn't join my class until 2 weeks after we'd started, I can actually weight that student's mark for that first assessment at 0, and my script will automatically skip grading that and use the other marks in that array and grade those. Now what I've done is I've checked to see if the mark is less than 1. The reason I'm doing that is if I get a mark that's a percent, then I know that my mark will be the percent times the weight. If I get a mark that's not a percent, but is actually a whole number out of 100, I can now determine that I need to divide that mark by 100 and then multiply it by the weight. Again, this will account for marks that are given either as percents or for whole numbers. I like to try and make my custom formulas as robust as possible so that it fits my different use cases. I add the current mark to the sum, and then I continue on with my loop until I've reached the end of my array of marks. So I start with the first mark, calculate the weighted piece of it, add it to the sum, continue on to the second one, calculate the weighted piece, add it to the sum until I've reached the end of my information. And the last piece is to return a value. I can return the sum, but this does not account for marks that are totaled out of 100. So the sum divided by the total weight will always return a percent, because if my total weights added up to 1, then sum divided by 1 will just be sum, which is a percent. If my total weights added up to 100, then sum divided by 100 will give me my total marks out of a percent. So it's a final piece of the puzzle to actually ensure that no matter what my input was, the output will always be a percent between 0 and 1. The last piece of my code here is a little bit of commenting. Commenting is used to make the code more human readable. So I have a little line here that says that this function will actually calculate the weighted average. But we've also got the option in Google Apps Script to create some of that autocomplete help. When you type in a spreadsheet formula, it pops up the autocomplete and shows the user what you're expecting. We can use comments to do the same thing for custom functions. So I've defined 2 parameters, the mark and the weight, and I've told the user that mark is a horizontal range that contains the marks to be weighed, and the weight is a horizontal range that contains the corresponding weights of the given marks. I'm also telling the user what we're returning, so the result of this function will be a weighted average, and I need to tell Google Apps Script that this is a custom function. That line tells it that this will actually be used as help documentation in my custom function. So when we have our calculate weighted average piece of the puzzle working, we can put that back in and work on the next pieces. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough time to go through all of these pieces and show you how I wrote them. I have posted the source code, and the link is available in the resources section. But I want to show you what it actually looks like. So first, I'd like to invite you to take the quiz. This is just a little Google Apps Script quiz. You can reach it by typing in goo.gl/forms, WE capital N, capital Z 99, capital N, lowercase n, 4K. This is actually a live quiz right now. So I have a form set up, and that feeds into a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet is set up to automatically grade it with Flubaroo. In that form, I have sample students. So if you're taking this quiz live right now, choose any student that you want. So I'll choose Maddie@AOL.com. Those are all fake email addresses. And I'll just fill out my form and submit it. So for the user, it looks exactly the same. The big difference now is that these are all going to feed in to my gradebook spreadsheet using Google Apps Script. The way I have it set up right now is in my Google Drive. I have my gradebook spreadsheet, and that's in a folder. In subfolders, I have assignments and quizzes. So if I look in my quizzes folder, I can see I have a spreadsheet of quiz 1. And this is just a sample that's set up the same way a Fluor results sheet would be. So all of my assessments are in the same folder or subfolders as my gradebook. And when I want to incorporate those grades, I can come in and I can type in manually, which I used to do, quiz 1. I can get the link to it. I can paste it there. And I use the spreadsheet ID because I was using an import range to actually incorporate the results from other spreadsheets into my gradebook. So I have all of that information in my Sheets tab, and what I can do is I can transpose that. That's going to give me a header. So I'm going to transpose that range, and when I add information to this tab of assessments, it's going to show up here. What I can do is I can start weighting my different assessments. I have another custom formula that is lookup mark. So if I type in equals lookup mark, you'll see that the help pops up and it tells me that this looks up a student's mark from the given spreadsheet ID. So I need the student ID, and I'm going to use a $sign in front of my column description because I want to anchor this formula to column C. That way when I drag it to the right, I won't lose that cell reference. And then I need the ID of the spreadsheet, and that's going to be in cell F3. This one I don't want to anchor to the column, I want to anchor it to the row. So I'm going to type in F, a $sign, and then a 3. And when I hit enter, it's going to look up that mark from that spreadsheet. The reason I used the anchors is because now I can double click that formula and it will grab the mark for each of the students. If I format these as a %, it looks a little more clean. And this is where I can use my weighted average formula. So I've made sure that my 2 weights are equal to 100. In this cell, I can type in equals weighted average, and here's where my autocomplete comes in handy. It shows me that I have a horizontal range of the marks. So I choose my horizontal range, separate it with a comma, and now I'm going to choose my horizontal range for the weightings. And again, I want to anchor this to row 4 by using $signs. So it's calculated the weighted average. What happens if I change the weights? Well, if it doesn't add up to 100, it can tell me that weights must sum to 100. Once I fix that, it will actually recalculate. And I can use that same formula to calculate the weighted average for each student. That's helpful, but I still have to go in and get the quiz name, the link, and the ID. So I decided to write a little bit of code that would find all of my assessments that exist in the folder or subfolder. To get into the script editor from a spreadsheet, you click on Tools and you choose the Script Editor. That'll open this window for you, and this is where your code lives. And this, you can see, this is my custom formulas. I have the weighted average function here, and down below it, I have the lookup mark function. But you can have more than one script file inside a spreadsheet. And what I've done is I've broken it down into different pieces. So I have formulas, which is my script file of all my custom formulas. I also have menu. This adds a custom menu to my spreadsheet. So when I open my spreadsheet, I've told AppScript to add a custom menu called Gradebook and to add a single item to it called Gather Grades. This will actually go through and it will grab every single assessment that exists in that folder or subfolder and dump it into this spreadsheet. You can see my custom menu here. It's called Gradebook. I click on Gradebook and I have one option, which is Gather Grades. When I run that, what's going to happen is now I have all of my different assessments here. And I can click on this link, and now I can see the EduOnAir sample quiz. So I can see some people have filled out this quiz. But if I look back at my gradebook, because I used a transpose formula, I now actually have all of my assessments showing up here. So what I can do is I can use this formula. And remember, I used the anchors so that when I drag this formula to the right, it's still going to be looking up that student who exists in column C. So I drag that formula to the right, and in my last column, you can see it shows 6,500%. That's because that last column, the number is actually a mark out of 100. Now if I grab these formulas and I drag them down, I've got the marks for every student for every assessment. And it happens very quickly. All I need to do now is adjust my weighted average formula. And what I'll do, instead of calculating weighted average on a terminating range, so a range with a given start and end, I'm going to define an open-ended range. This is going to give me the option of expanding to accommodate more and more assessments. So now what I can do is I can change the weighting of things. So let's say that's 15%, that's 15%, that's 20%, and I've got two more, so 12, 13, 12, and 13. Now that my weights all sum to 100, and I am ignoring this EduOnAir sample quiz, I should get a result. And my result was not a number, which is unfortunate. Let's try this. So now I have my weighted average for every student. What I like to do is I like to have my students' weightings all defined manually. So I'm going to put my student information here, and I'm going to put the assessment information over here. This will give me the option to weight things the way I would like to have them weighted for each individual student. So instead of having every student use the same weighting, which is what I've done here, I can actually define custom weightings. So what I can do is I can have the sum just so that I can check that I've got everything adding up to 100. And let's say I'll do 10 for each assessment. I'll make assignment 1 worth 30. So now I've got my weights all add up to 100. And I'll create absolute cell references. all of these. So I've done a little bit, but right now what I've got is an array that just shows me exactly the same thing. I can actually use that array. I know that for a few of my students, I would like to weigh EduOnAir sample quiz, but for the rest of them, I actually want it to be weighted as 0. So if I enter that as 0, and then I look at some of my students, I know that Leota Dilliard, I can weight it as 10. And I can change those weightings. So Megan Garufi, I'll change that weighting as well. Now in my weighted average formula, I'll take mark range and the weight range I'll take from my other sheet. And let's make sure that my weighted average is correct. What it's going to do is it should actually calculate that weighted average. Because I didn't account for that. See, it's nice because it actually accounts to make sure that I've got that proper weighting sum. So now if I look, I can see I have to change Leota's and Megan's. And just by having a single sheet with those different weightings on it, my formula has accounted for that. So using AppScript, we can do some very complicated stuff. Some of the stuff I like to do has taken me a long time to actually get to. For example, one of the things that I'm quite pleased with is this ability to go in and get all the spreadsheets. So I broke this piece of the task into smaller pieces. Again, I have a function here that will get all the grade spreadsheets. So it uses the folders in which this grade book exists and loops through the folders. Now, I actually have a different function called loop through folders, and there's a very specific reason I did that. When you're looping through folders, you're going into a folder and you're checking to see if that folder contains spreadsheets. In each of the spreadsheets in that folder, you're checking to see if there are any sheets named grades, which is what Flubaroo generates. But there's another piece to this puzzle. In that folder, you want to check and see if there are any subfolders. If there are subfolders, you want to go in and do the same thing. You want to loop through those subfolders again. So it becomes a loop. And one of the things that I like about this is it uses what's called recursion. Loop through folders will go in and it will check to see if there are any sheets in the folder using this function called getSheetsFromFolder. It adds them to my list of sheets. And the last thing it does is it will actually check to see if there is a folder if there are subfolders within this folder. If there are subfolders within this folder, it will go in and it will, in that subfolder, call the same function again. So it's recursive. So what happens is this loop through folders will execute in this parent folder. So in this parent folder, loop through folders will check to see if there are any gradebook spreadsheet, any graded assessment spreadsheets, and it will check to see if there are any subfolders. It knows that there's an assignment subfolder. So it will go into assignments and call loop through folders again to check for any assessment spreadsheets within this subfolder. The last thing it will do is it will check for subfolders. It doesn't have any in this case, so there are no subfolders to go into. It will then go back and continue on to the next folder called quizzes, and it will check for any assessment spreadsheets that I have in this quizzes folder. It can do this for any number of folder depth. So if I have a new subfolder here, I'll call this term 1, I can put my quizzes into different places. I can move things around. And my script doesn't care because it's actually going through every single subfolder in this main folder. So we can use Google Apps Script to solve a lot of challenges. We can go in and we can connect to different services. This example gradebook connects to the spreadsheet service and to the Drive app service. So it goes into Google Drive and it looks through all the spreadsheets. It then looks into each individual spreadsheets and checks if that's an assessment spreadsheet. If it is, it then incorporates those grades into this gradebook. If it's not, it just continues. There are other services that we can connect to as well. We can connect to the calendar service. So we can create calendar events or modify calendar events, check when the next appointment is, and so on. We can also connect to the Gmail service, which means I can create and send email messages. I can also look through my inbox for email messages. So we can create actions that are either based on email messages or that will send out email messages. You could have an option in this gradebook to actually email the updated grades to all of your students with a single menu command. There are a couple of things that I would love to see the ability to connect to, which right now is not possible. We can't connect to the Slides app. So there's no easy way for me to start an action based on my Google Slides. So if I transfer to the next slide, I can't trigger anything to happen in Google Apps Script. I can do it in forms. So when somebody submits a form, I can take an action. I can tell Google Apps Script that I want to do something, whether that's send a confirmation email to somebody that their form submission has been accepted, if it's to send them a notification that they can edit their response, I can do that, or I can notify myself. This is how scripts like Flubru are able to auto-grade and send results right away. They are triggered when you submit a form, and then they take those actions, which are to process the information to create that graded result, and then to send that email out to the given email address. We can also connect to external services. So anything that has an API, we can actually use Google Apps Script to talk to it. I've worked a little bit with the Twitter API. There are other APIs out there. For example, the admin console has an API. So we can write scripts to go in and retrieve information, whether that be something like all of the Google groups on your domain. We can also write scripts that will take actions. So we could create groups, enroll accounts into those groups. We can retrieve information about accounts. Anything that you have access to as a super administrator, a script that you're running will also be able to access that. And that's an important thing to know. When you're running a script, it asks for authorization to take action on your behalf. When you run it, it runs as if you were doing those commands yourself. So when I run this gradebook script, what it's doing is it's opening up each spreadsheet and it's copying information with the same authorization as I have with my account. That means if I don't have access to some of those spreadsheets, I won't be able to open them, and I won't be able to copy that information. So the script is restricted. It also means that if I have access to other spreadsheets, I can use that script on other spreadsheets as well if I'd like. So if somebody shares assessment with me, I can incorporate that assessment into my gradebook if I so choose. Google Apps Script does ask for authorization before you allow it to run. And in that authorization, it tells you the scope of what it will actually be accessing. If that was too much too fast, you can come back to this later on. This broadcast will be available on the Education on Air website starting tomorrow. There is information on my own website, which is opensourceteacher.ca, and you can also make a copy of this gradebook spreadsheet. All of the source code is contained in there. Because we had time limits, I wasn't able to go through everything in full detail. But I'd like to open it up to some questions now, if we have any questions that people would like to ask.
We do have one question from Daniel, and he asks, how does one start learning to script from a beginner stage, no previous programming experience?
That's a really good question. So to start from the beginner stage, there are some quick start tutorials. So if you go to developers.google.com/appscript, and if you can't remember that, don't worry about it. All you need to type into Google is Google Apps Script Quick Start. Down here, there are 5-minute quick starts.
Sorry, James, can you just share that screen? We can't see it really well.
Sure.
Sorry, thanks.
So down here, there are 5-minute quick starts for docs, forms, or there are macros and custom functions. This is a good place to start. This is how I start, is with the custom spreadsheet functions. So this help documentation does show you a little bit about what Google Apps Script does, but it's very light on the instruction. I found that it does take a little bit of time to actually get into understanding the language and what each instruction does. You can see here these tutorials are very much copy and paste into your own spreadsheet. So they're a little bit light on the instruction. You can also use sites like Code Academy or Code School, and you can take their courses which are on JavaScript. Google Apps Script is based on JavaScript, but it has a few different aspects to it in terms of how it connects to the Google services. And finally, one of the things that I'm very excited about, which I've been working on quite a lot, is I'm creating an App Script for Educators course. So this will be specifically about Google Apps Script in a school context. If you are interested in learning Google Apps Script, you can go to this form here, goo.gl/forms, enter that URL, and I'll just ask for your name and email address. This will be a great place to get started from scratch learning Google Apps Script. So it starts at the very beginning, somebody who has never written a line of code before, and I'll take you through the whole process of understanding Google Apps Script. There are a few different aspects to it. When you're talking about just manipulating information the way we did in our gradebook, that's JavaScript. When you start developing add-ons that have sidebars that show up, that's actually HTML and jQuery and CSS. So it gets into more complicated languages, but in terms of getting started from scratch, those quick starts are a good place to get going. And for questions, you can always join the Google Plus community for App Script for Educators. So if we go to Google Plus, you can find a community called AppScript for Educators, Builders, and Users. Oh, and I just lost the link there. So AppScript for Education, Builders, and Users. This is a great place to go to get started, to ask questions. It is more focused on using add-ons and AppScript, but it's also very helpful if you have questions about coding. Hope that answers
I'm sure
that
there's
question.
also, yeah, you definitely did. I think there's so much information always coming out too, so it's great for questions and new updates and all that stuff too, right?
Yeah, there's always great information here. There are announcements posted regularly. People who have questions on just using a script will ask them. And it also helps bridge that initial transfer between using an add-on and starting to understand how the add-on works, what it's doing, and then starting to write some code for add-ons.
Awesome. We have one other question. What are some add-ons that would be good to use?
Some add-ons that would be good to use. That really depends on where your strengths are, what you like doing with add-ons. I'm a math teacher. I absolutely love the GMath add-on. So that's an add-on for forms or docs that lets you put in simple math expressions. It lets you turn them into, it lets you turn regular text into proper looking equations, create graphs and charts, and things like that. I also really like the Flubru and Doctopus add-ons. They are very powerful for managing assessment. Let me see what other add-ons I like. I do like Autocrat. That will actually generate a document based on every single form submission. And if you have other questions about add-ons, I actually have a section on my website, one for add-ons for docs and one for add-ons for sheets. So I've broken it down into two separate parts because the add-ons for docs are definitely different from the add-ons for sheets. So you can head over to my website, opensourceteacher.ca, and under resources you'll see add-ons for docs or add-ons for sheets. Do we have any other questions?
No, we don't, but as you know, I have bothered you many times with many questions all of the time. So if you guys have questions, you can tweet him. I've written down it. Is it going to be backwards? Anyway,
Nope.
at jpeterson02 on Twitter, and he always answers me. So now he has to always answer you. So he's always there to help. So just shoot him a tweet, and he'll definitely help you with whatever questions.
Well, thanks everybody for watching. Thank you so much, Amy, for co-hosting with me. And
My pleasure.
I hope all you viewers enjoy the rest of the Education on Air conference. And as always, you can get in touch with me if you have questions about any app scripting things. And I strongly encourage you to join the Google Plus community for AppScript for Education. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye-bye.